exposed for all to see, probably even laugh at, the absurdities of Rhode Island's COVID-19 pandemic response exposed at a great event put on by Dr. Andrew Boston last night in Cranston. Just a moment or two, I'll be joined by intrepid media personality Pat Ford. He and I will talk about the media's response in the event last week. All right, let's bring in Pat Ford. Pat, welcome back to In the Dugout.
Mike, thanks for having me. And I have a feeling today is going to be an extension of the atmosphere and the fun and the love that we had the other night. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, well, as it turned out, because we had a whole bunch of speakers, I don't know, 10 or 12 speakers. You and I are the last two, and the Cranston Library wouldn't allow us to stay longer, so we didn't get a chance to give our comments. So we're going to do that today, you and I. It was a great event. We're going to have video posted on Ocean State Current very soon. You are live at the Commerce Department, right?
Your Commerce RI later on in just a little bit. There's going to be the monthly board meeting. The usual hijinks, balderdash, and assorted nonsense will take place. A concerted effort will be made to redistribute your taxpayer money to sources unknown as we continue here in the state of Rhode Island to subsidize risk and privatize profit. It's a magical thing, actually, sitting back here. I come here every month, and it's a never-ending source of really
people with their hands out, and how can we screw the taxpayers and help some special interest group, right?
Right. As I like to say, from 38 studios to 38 stadium and a whole lot in between.
Yeah, and some people tried to call me 38 Stenhouse, so I didn't like that too much. But anyway, that's actually John Laughlin would call me that. All right, let's go here, Pat. You got in. Well, let's just play this. This short video we're going to show exemplifies everything in the. You and I, our topic last week was supposed to be the media's response or lack of thereof. Let's play this and let's have everyone listen in here.
Dr. Scott, in the case of Southwell v. Governor McKee in the Rhode Island Department.
So this is one of their regular press conferences they would have, right?
Yep. And or the administration building.
I want you to talk about those press conferences because let's finish this. Basically, I'm going to jump ahead. You lay out all this information why masks don't work, the lawsuit and everything, right? And let's watch this.
I believe that.
Masking works. It helps keep our children and people safe, and it's the tool that we want to use to make sure that our kids are able to stay in school and learn and do what's needed.
Did you listen to or
Thank
read
you.
The transcripts involved in the case, or are you just going to continue on?
We only have 2 more minutes.
They wouldn't let you ask a follow-up question. You laid out all the reasons why masking, all the research why and her only response was masking
works. Mike. So what happened during the Rona, if you will, starting out at the vet during the period of Gina Raimondo's reign, there would be a weekly or bi-weekly press conference, and for a large part, it was subject of the day. The subject of the day was typically Corona. After a while, it branched out a little bit. There was a little bit extra follow-up. What's fascinating is that, incredibly enough, I found Gina Raimondo, although I disagree with her on virtually everything in life other than rugby, all right, to be an engaging, interesting, willing to debate kind of leader. Really wanted to dive in with me, would argue with me. A couple of times, we'd be having these great conversations, much to the frustration of a couple of media personalities, and our people would literally come over and separate us. And it was all in good fun, but at the same time, it was deadly serious. And we could have an honest conversation. Now, flash forward, after a while, they took them out of the vet. The pandemic was starting to lighten up, and they would have these press conferences over at the administration building in that room. And what was stunning the entire time, this is the words I wanted to use the other night, were a willful studied ignorance.
Yes.
Facts ceased to matter when you go in that room. It was the party line. And what was the worst part about that, other than 1 or 2 holdouts, everyone in that room, including the media, embraced the party line. And
All right, let me stop you there for 1 second because I got to tell you a story I was going to tell. So this is part of what I was going to say last week along those lines. So Dan York is one of those, right? Dan York is close friends
Definitely.
with Dan McKee. Dan York completely drinks the Kool-Aid. I
Right.
called into his show once and said, Dan McKee made a statement. Oh, we're considering opinions and research from all different perspectives before we make a decision. And I put something out on Twitter like, no, he's not. And Dan York challenged me on it. Said, why don't you come on my show to discuss? And he buried me on the show. Boy, how dare you say that Dan? I said, he can't be considering other opinions if he's making these decisions because the research shows that,
Right.
that there's no support for these decisions. Right, Pat?
None. There's none. There never was. And on multiple occasions, I had the opportunity to ask, I think, pointed questions. And number one, people would get frustrated because there would be a run-up and to the question. And the reason why I always did those run-ups was, number one, to frame it for the listener and viewer. But just as importantly, I felt important to actually give the information to the state officials because it was clear that they didn't even have it themselves.
James McDonald admitted that on the stand, right?
Right. It just, McDonald, that's another one. But the willful studied ignorance of the people in that room was astonishing to me. And there were several moments that were pretty evocative. During this on again, off again shutdowns, lockdowns, I think Gina at one point called them my term for them was the purge, a la the movie, because basically they were locking down entire portions of the state with really no underlying reasoning other than fear and the famous philosophy of never let a good opportunity or never let a good crisis go to waste. So every now and then they would lift these at some level. And I just remembered two different media personalities, names you would know, people you see on TV, not asking the question or posing the question academically, like what's the underlying reasoning between stopping the lockdowns now, or what's the underlying reasoning for opening up the quote unquote opening up the economy again, which, by the way, as a libertarian, you can imagine, I found just grating every time I heard that, the notion that somehow they were opening up the economy. But what was the worst part about it was they didn't phrase the questions in a generic, neutral way like that. They literally asked questions like, why aren't you continuing the lockdown? Why aren't you continuing?
Yes, they were cheerleading. They couldn't wait for the next lockdown or mandate, right?
Right. The sense of outrage that they had that somehow, free society would blossom again, which clearly on every single level needed to happen within weeks of the onset of the quote unquote pandemic. It needed to happen.
Let me ask you this, Pat.
Astonishing.
Let me ask you this. Other than you, I think John DePietro might have asked a semi-difficult question here or there. We never showed up at the press conferences. Other than you, was there anyone else in the corporate media, the Journal, Go Local, Prov, Valley Breeze, any of the TV that ever asked a critical question that you saw?
No. And
isn't that, as I said the other night, isn't it the job of the media to be guardians of truth?
Absolutely. You're not there. You're not the supporting cast. You're not the extras that are just populating the scene to promote some bizarre sense of freedom that simply ceased to exist. And I believe this continues to cease to exist with this administration. No, you're absolutely right. We're not supposed to be their friends. I'll never forget the time. I wish I could find it. Ian Donis of NPR actually got a happy birthday tweet. I think it was either a tweet or a birthday card from Gina. There are a few things in life I can guarantee, Mr. Stenhouse, but one of them is that I will never, ever get a birthday card or a tweet or even a functional human recognition from this current administration. They attempt to blackball me. They attempt to keep me out. And oh well.
Sure. All right. Let me ask you this.
Sure.
Did you get the sense? Now, I think the most stunning remark from a public official was from Gina Raimondo. The most stunningly stupid remark, I should say, was from Gina Raimondo at some point in the early summer after of 2020, when she said, our goal here is to have zero transmission. Zero. Yeah. All right. Now, that leads to this question. Speak for Raimondo, speak for McKee. Do you think they just 100% took whatever the Rhode Island Department of Health officials had told them, and that was going to be gospel? Or do you think they put any independent intellectual curiosity and research into it? I mean, to make a statement like that, I
Right.
got to believe that Nicole Alexander Scott told Gina that that was possible.
No, and I'll give you a specific example. One of the doctors who was in charge of the field hospital spoke at one of the Veterans Memorial events. And it was interesting because, the field hospitals, of course, are one of the great unwritten boondoggles in Rhode Island history.
Right.
Who knows how much money was really spent? How much of it was really spent just to buffer the convention center financially? Who knows who was really ever even treated there? But interestingly enough,
The Caprianato group got paid quite a lot for their field hospital. Never got used, I don't think, did it?
Nope. And so I asked a question, interestingly enough, from an opposing viewpoint. And, long COVID syndrome has been an area of dispute and discussion separate from the masking argument. And there are some legitimate cases being on display right now that there are some long-term impacts on people. So I asked this doctor, and I asked Gina Raimondo at this, why haven't you done more to explain or at least describe or at least investigate whether that's reality or not and how serious they are? And I posed the question as almost a supportive question of them, because again, if the premise is this is a deadly pandemic, then isn't there any intellectual curiosity as to the long-term impacts of it?
Oh, Pat, you just went mute. Unmute yourself. Pat, you just went mute. Pat, unmute yourself. Somehow you went mute. There you go. All right, go ahead.
Are we back? Can you hear me now?
You're back. Get closer to the mic,
Can't
please.
hear you. The vagaries of the internet.
Go ahead. Keep talking. Go ahead. We can hear you.
I'm muted. You want me to leave and come back again?
We can hear you.
I hear you now.
All right, we can hear you.
Okay, that's better. So there was no intellectual curiosity because
Zero.
none. There was no research done into long COVID. In the same way that the doctor,
Well, there's no research done into anything.
picky. All right. So you had the Dr. McDonald's infamous testimony about whether or not children had actually gotten ill or not. But I will tell you two compelling moments. One spoke directly to a conversation I'd had with Dr. Bostom and other doctors. And the controversy, of course, was that at that time, a newspaper in Florida took the unspoken step of actually, on their own volition, publishing data that broke down death stats by death as a result of COVID and death where COVID was present.
Right.
And this shook the world. It was a medical center down in Florida. And at a meeting in Woonsocket, I asked that question. And I got some of us are old enough to remember the original Charlie Brown series. I got the wah, because at no time until literally the end of the pandemic did they really provide any breakdown of what is an existential set of data. How many people simply had it in their bloodstream versus how many
Never provided any supporting research or data, did they?
Right.
Just the CDC says this or the Department of Health says that, and that was it, right? That was
Right.
it.
They got the same emails I got. I'm on the press list with the CDC. Literally,
All right.
it sounded like talking points.
All right, Pat. I wrote a column a year ago after Nicole Alexander Scott resigned, basically saying this is a chance for McKee to remake the Rhode Island into something. And I listed basically all the mistakes they made, from not recognizing natural immunity to things that, as it turns out, Pat, was there one major guideline, recommendation, policy, or mandate that they got right? It seems to me that 100% of their decisions were wrong.
Correct. You go back, harken back in time, and that was the beautiful part of the other night. We had a whole lot of people who had been sort of I don't want to say in silos, because that's a pejorative, but who had all been doing things on their own. We all kind of got together, and it was almost like a reunion feeling. But, ultimately, remember back to when Walmart could be open for certain things and not. And if you were the local Ace Hardware, you had to be closed. I mean, just the sheer on its face stupidity of that spoke to everyone. And that's interestingly enough, I mean, as you know, when it comes to public policy, buy-in is everything. And that's when they started to lose people because it just none of it made any sense. We can't go to a local garden center, but we can go to Lowe's.
Right.
What? You know, and not allowing people the fundamental freedom to simply make their own decisions. You know, you at a certain point, we are all adults. And if we chose to go to a business that was open and did not meet these arbitrary and capricious set of standards, then that was our decision. It was the decision of the business owner to stay open.
That's
There's a
right.
mutuality there called the free market.
That's right. And free will and freedom in America. All right. So Rhode Island, so if we use the national analogy that Trump made famous, the swamp, Rhode Island has its own swamp, and it's the government, it's the agencies, it's the media, and there's another component to that, which I want to highlight here, and that's the nonprofit NGO community. The Rhode Island Foundation honored Nicole Alexander Scott with their Civic Leadership Award for the great leadership she provided during the pandemic, even though, as you and I just discussed, 100% of her decisions and recommendations were wrong, but yet the swamp rewarded her. What is the swamp in Rhode Island to you?
The swamp in Rhode Island to me is basically just about everything. You know, you take that example, this cult of personality existed surrounding her that she was, depending on your religious orientation, the second, third, or fourth coming. When in fact, there was just this casual incompetency there, yet it was everywhere. We all worshiped. In a sense, we for about a year and a half, we had a deity, and it was Dr. Nicole Alexander Scott. I can remember, Mike, one night, my wife, where she used to work, was a volunteer at Waterfire. And she's out on the boat doing the thing, and I'm sitting there watching. And I have this on video somewhere. I'm sitting having this blissful, peaceful night after a week of, well, spending a lot of time in what we call halitosis hall, all right? And I'm sitting there, and the music is playing, light opera, and the smoke is lifting up. And all of a sudden, I hear, masks work. And this voice came from out of nowhere, as if, again, the heavens had opened, and Dr. Scott had spoken. So even outside at Waterfire at 11 o'clock at night in a semi-driving rainstorm, surrounded by smoke and maybe an adult beverage, I was never that far from her.
Or two.
Not unlike, if you will, you know, the Orwellian. Let's just call it for what it is. It is, and I don't use that loosely. I don't use that term lightly. It was Orwellian in virtually every aspect. The social doom and gloom that was brought down upon you, the Sturm and Drang of the collective liberal elite in the state, if in fact you did not choose to worship at the altar of all things, Dr. Scott, could result in your own personal, financial, and social, I'll use the word destruction. And you and I know business.
Ask Dr. Scully, right?
Right. Ask Dr. Scully. Listen, there's a couple other business owners you and I know that took the brunt because they dared speak elsewhere. They dared to host congregate groups of people who spoke an opinion that differed from the, you know, if you will, the Bible, if you will, the state of Rhode Island. So listen, like there was a moment, you know, I was thinking about what's the most powerful moment that I had in covering this. And I've got it on video because I have everything on video, right? I had the opportunity to ask Gina Raimondo a philosophical question. I spoke to her about, and people know me as a libertarian will laugh when I say this, but sometimes I try to translate so they understand. And I spoke to her about how often societies are judged in times of turmoil by the level of shared sacrifice. And I asked her, and I pointed out several cases that there was no shared sacrifice, that in fact, during the pandemic, two alternative societies were created. Government. You often heard Gina talk about the need to make sure that our government family in Rhode Island, right? Remember that the Obama term, the federal family, right? That our government and family was safe and that they were employed and that they were intact. And I don't doubt that there are a bunch of people who worked really hard during that period of time. Usually the people in the lower end of the pay grade, if you know what I mean. But ultimately, there was no shared sacrifice. There were no layoffs. There were no cutbacks. There was
not at the government level, right? Not at the government level. And nobody was held accountable for their mistakes and errors?
Right. And you and I know countless individuals who lost their jobs because they would not comply. You and I know countless business people generational businesses, that third and fourth generation businesses, ultimately met their demise during or immediately after that because of the level of damage done to them financially. And yet there will, as all of a sudden the elites understand that they might have screwed up a little bit. They're looking for accountants and they're looking for, some type of support and encouragement. But what about the people that you and I know who literally had their lives destroyed, not by the disease, all right, but by the government reaction to the disease? And that's
right. That's right.
Great sin of our generation.
And Friday nights, and by the way, to our viewers out there, if you go to oceanstatecurrent.com, featured right in the top is one of these stories, Dr. Bostom's oversight event. It's a great event. Right now, we've got 3 clips up, but there will be about 8 or 10 more going up there in the coming, probably within the next 24 hours or even 18 hours. But and most of the people told stories of the absolute absurdities.
Right.
Like Dr. like Dr. Scully not passing his business COVID test because he was actually working on a patient. Now, he's an oral surgeon who didn't have on a mask.
Right.
You can't make this stuff up.
No, it's the theater of the absurd. And the problem is here in Rhode Island that every day in Rhode Island government is theater of the absurd. And we've become so inured to it. We've become so desensitized to it. And at a certain degree, we have this almost dark humor about it that we've forgotten about the real impact on people across the state, across socioeconomic lines. Ultimately, I think, as you and I know, the people who suffer the most are the ones who have the least. The incompetent reaction to what was going on in the inner cities because of the sheer, if you will, closeness, if you will, of how people live. And yet everything was driven out toward the suburb. It just step after step after step after step was just an utter disaster. And the problem is that you're right, there is no accountability. The Mutual Admiration Society, that is Rhode Island government, kind of skips past this like they do so many episodes on a daily basis. The trail of tears and the utter unrequited failure at every level of this disease we call Rhode Island government continues to amaze me. The trouble is most people in cities like Pawtucket,
they have no idea.
They're just.
And there is a cancel culture in this state, and it happened to me. Tell me if you've been canceled or tried to be, but I was writing columns at the time for the Rhode Island Echo, which was formerly, Rhode Island Wave, which was formerly the Rhode Island Echo.
Right.
And when I wrote that piece criticizing Alexander Scott and how they got everything wrong, they said Dr. Scott contacted us, asking us to retract the story. We can't do that, but we can fire you. So I was fired from that because I dared to tell the truth. And this is something I think, I don't know if you want to relate it to Tucker Carlson, what happened in the news today about him, but it seems as if the truth is now an inconvenient truth, unacceptable and too extreme for many, even news stations like Fox News. Nobody wants to hear the truth if it conflicts with their agenda. Your thought on that?
It's interesting because I have friends across the political spectrum. The ones that I find most dangerous and are the most culpable in the current situation are what I call the neoliberals. And that, of course, is the Bloombergs, the Raimondos, all of that of the world, who are shadow capitalists, but using government to provide them with their measure of quote unquote controlled capitalism. I'll be almost like an oligarchy. They will not. They're astonishingly efficient at wordsmithing. They're astonishingly efficient and loyal to each other in terms of staying on message. And that's the problem, because ultimately folks who support freedom, either on the extreme left or even on the extreme right, don't have that kind of discipline. We fight amongst ourselves at times. They use government as a hammer. And that's where it gets tough, because ultimately what they were able to do was take this extreme example of never letting a crisis go to waste and use it to exert controls in areas that they never have before. And the media is one of them. I haven't done it lately. I think I will, and I'll get back to you on this. I did a APRA on the amount of money that the Department of Health spent on local media. It was the year before, where the Department of Health actually sponsored the Bristol 4th of July parade broadcast. Now, what that's got to do with anything other than feathering the nest of an organization is, yeah, come on. And given the state of corporate media these days, do you think that they're going to turn down that kind of funding, followed up by an incredibly expensive campaign? And as a result, what criticism have you seen of state government at all?
This is how the government, I found this outside of COVID and advertising. This is how the government corrupts and compromises virtual every institution in this state. You know, you're right. No media entity wants to turn down those advertising dollars, so they don't have their reporters ask curious questions. Business. I've talked to so many business. I can't tell you the frustration, Pat. I've talked to, you probably have too. I've talked to so many heads of business associations and business groups in this state, I won't mention names, who are outraged at the progressive left anti-business policies, but yet every one of them gets like a $200,000 handout from the government every year. And we can't speak up because we don't want to give up that little crumb we get.
Right. And what's crazy about it, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like charity. Government in this case has driven the economy into the ground intentionally so that they are the only real source. Right. I mean, I would be fascinated if it was possible to separate the gross domestic product of the state of Rhode Island from the dreaded private sector and what comes from the teats, if you will, of government. And I would imagine it'd be a pretty dramatic number. And so you crush business, you crush the free market, and then you simply don't allow any other opportunity for other resources to come in, unless, of course, it's at the hand of the wise and wonderful McKee. Yeah.
I got one more related issue to bring up before we go to an unrelated story that speaking of McKee, do you have time for 2 more questions?
Absolutely.
All right. To wrap up Thursday night's event, again, we're going to have the video by tomorrow evening. We'll have the video of every speaker up, edited, nice, synced with the audio from that really great event last Thursday night, put on by Dr. Bostom. But shouldn't every one of those people who spoke, shouldn't every one of them be invited by either the Senate or House Oversight Committee? Shouldn't this be something that General Assembly leadership should be doing? An honest look back at the state's official COVID response. I mean, this is just another example of General Assembly leadership, the cowardice, and not willing to conduct their constitutional duties. Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. You know, in any business event, you and I both come from the business world, and the current term du jour is you do a postmortem, which is kind of a ghastly way of looking at it, but in this case, it's pretty accurate. And you do a postmortem and you look back and you take an honest, and sometimes really do,
honest in government? Wait a minute, you're not going to put those 2 words together, are you?
You do an honest self-assessment of what really happened, and you document and you go through it, and we all agree that what could have been done better, which is pretty much everything, and what we did well, which was largely nothing. Remember, shots in the arms, baby. And that should be part of government. It's part of business, and there are times when that can be personally challenging to a lot of people who, in retrospect, the woman at Budweiser made a bad decision. And that's what needs to happen. That's part of the governmental process that's been, to your point, has been completely lost. But what's your next question?
I look at the ethics commission. They don't do their job either, right? I mean, that ruling we had with the firefighter committee had recently. All right. Let's go to your story. I know you've only got a minute left because you got to get to that meeting. All right. So you guys on CoalitionRadioNetwork.com have a story up about a tale of fraud. What's going on here?
All right. So the 2 brothers, Daniel and Grant, who are the, if you will, as one court described them as the heart and soul, if you will, of both Benevolent, which is the predecessor to the current Fortuitous investment groups, have quite a trail, and they've left quite a trail over the decades. And now you get to, of course, the oversight question again. So they were involved in a documented.
This is Daryl and Brett Johnson, the supposed financiers of the Tidewater soccer stadium.
Yeah,
deal, right?
I call him Daniel for some reason. So yeah, Brett and Brett Johnson. They were involved in a business called Burn Lounge, and it was an early adopter back in the 2000s, if you will, of this whole streaming prospect and how you could sell streaming services. The FTC, after several complaints, labeled their operation, of which they were significant inventors, and eventually Grant became, after the initial CEO was fired, he became the CEO of the company. They labeled them as a pyramid scheme. And what's a pyramid scheme? A pyramid
The
scheme.
FTC did?
Yeah, the FTC did.
Wow. So
The
that's
Federal
that's
Trade
not your words up here. That's the FTC.
That's the FTC's words. In
And
fact,
this
in
is the
article-
group that we've entrusted to build the stadium?
Yes, yes. And ultimately, it was a $17 million settlement. The company was formally enjoined from engaging in deceptive trade practices and engaging in a pyramid scheme. This, by the way, and all of this I have documented. I have links to the Federal Trade Commission's investigation. I have links to all the litigation. This was affirmed by an appellate court. And ultimately, they stopped doing business in that manner. And then ultimately, they went out of business, but to the loss of millions of dollars of individuals. And there's a couple of questions at work here. Did anyone do any due diligence? Did anyone ask any questions? How is it possible that we routinely have these bad characters show up to the state, right, and just get written millions of dollars of checks? While meanwhile, again, I'll draw back our experience from Thursday night. We listened to business owners who never got, the type of unemployment, or were forced into all sorts of unwieldy situations. Yet these folks, it's if you're of a certain age, remember every boy needs a band. And then if you're a little bit younger, you think about monorail from The Simpsons, right? You have these con artists, and I'll use that word, and I'll stand behind that word. These con artists come to town who have terrible track records. Mike, this isn't even the only case. I'm breaking another one tomorrow at some point. I'm just waiting for a couple of just a couple of double.
No, even worse than that.
Mhm.
Again, I'm not going to play your entire setup here, but I'll play a few seconds. You were able to ask Governor McKee if he was concerned about all these questions. Let me share the video and show you what Governor McKee, his voluminous answer to you. Let me turn on the audio.
Commission ultimately labeled a pyramid scheme in order to pay consumers $17 million back. Are you at all concerned that Commerce RI failed to do due diligence on a variety of these investments?
No.
That's it. No, not
it.
concerned. Not concerned. We're doing business with a convicted pyramid scheme operator.
And Mike, that's just the first case. There's plenty more out there. It harkens back to what was it, that great philosopher from Saturday Night Live, Emily Latella? Never mind.
According to another news source, this group has lost $17 million on their books. Is this issue? Is that why you're at the Commerce Department? Is this issue going to be brought on tonight's agenda?
I am. I'm going to bring it up.
Okay.
I got my own agenda when it comes to the Commerce Corp.
Well, come back on our show and tell us what you find out.
Oh, absolutely, buddy. And and again, time after time, these self-inflicted moral, philosophical, financial gunshot wounds that we bring to ourselves. I'll close out, if you will. I think it was a Pogo in the early 20th century was a cartoon, and I think the famous quote from Pogo was, "I have seen the enemy, and he is us." As you know better than anyone alive, as Larry knows, and everyone at your center knows, elections have consequences.
And voters don't seem to understand what those consequences are. Just like they were kept in the dark about COVID. Everybody thinks the Department of Health and the government did a great job navigating them through COVID. They also think they're doing a great job with our schools and our economy. And it's just amazing how the untruth can carry the day. And again, you and I are supposed to talk about the media. I call them, they're supposed to be the fourth estate or the guardians of truth. They are the exact opposite. They are the guardians of the untrue narratives. Pat Ford, thank you for your time today. Thank you for all you do. We got to have you on more regularly back here and in the dugout.
Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio.
All right, Pat Ford, good luck at the meeting today.
Thanks, buddy.
All right.